Welcome to the special edition of the Electric Africa podcast, recorded live at the convening AI Artists and Immersive Futures in Johannesburg. I'm Ajo Ankoma, Director of Policy and Research at Electric South. Over the last 3 days, we brought together artists, technologists, researchers, and cultural thinkers to reimagine how AI and immersive media intersect with African creativity. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Ian Mangenga, a social technologist and community builder whose work explores equity, access, and representation in tech spaces. Ian, thank you so much for being here. Ian, for our listeners who may not know your journey, could you start by telling us a bit about yourself, how you came into the space, and the kinds of communities you've been building?
Thank you so much, Ajoa. And hi to everyone. My name is Ian Mangenga. I am a social technologist who also considers herself the accidental girl boss, because I like to believe that I fell into the space that I'm in because I knew very early on in varsity that I did not want to work in corporate, or rather I did not want to follow a traditional career path. But coming from a science background, where I studied geography and archaeology, having a deep interest in African cities, cultures, histories, I got to understand societies from like a historical perspective, learn about trends, and also learn how to use various tech platforms to just dig deeper into societal stuff. And yeah, so I was sitting there with all these skill sets and I was like, okay, what's next for me? Luckily in university, I'd always been involved with student organizations or politics. So I've always had a deep love for social justice and civil society. So after graduating, I worked a little, and that did not work out for me because I felt like I wasn't achieving as much impact as I could or I wanted. So I started Digital Girl Africa, and the whole goal behind that was to get as many women as possible into the digital economy. And this was in 2018, and a lot of people did not understand what I was talking about when I'd say the digital economy, the creative economy, and it was always phrased as women in tech. A lot of the initiatives at that time focused on providing women with coding skills. And I did do that in the beginning, but I realized that it was still very exclusionary because the regular girl in forced law already feels like she's not smart enough to be a programmer, But I decided, what low-hanging fruits can we use to widen the scope and get more people involved? So that's when I started doing digital storytelling, masterclasses and workshops, social media management, content creation. And that sort of grew into its own vehicle where a lot of young women who wanted to learn more about their opportunities in the digital space came to our platform, and we've done a lot of amazing work. One of my proudest moments has been working with domestic workers, such a marginalized group of people, and we have this idea of domestic workers as uneducated, old women who cannot be employed anywhere else. And I won't lie, it was a big challenge trying to demystify these complex technological ideas to a woman who doesn't even know how to access WhatsApp on her phone. And that for me is where the genius is, right? Because if you have a phone, if you have a smartphone and you know how to use the internet, that is great. But there's so many more people who are not able to access opportunities and information because of that gap in digital literacy. So yeah, my work really does lie at the intersection of inclusive design, feminist technology, and African digital futures.
That's really amazing. I'm happy to have you here. I guess let's shift gears and dive into AI, the topic of the moment. From your vantage point, how do you see AI reshaping social dynamics in Africa, if you see it reshaping it at all, particularly for communities that have been historically excluded, like the demographics that you've mentioned? Yeah, how do you see them shaping these tech spaces through AI?
I think the conversation of AI in Africa is a really interesting one, especially when we think of how the global communities view the relationship that Africa has with technology. As someone who studied archaeology, I I know for a fact that technology actually did start in Africa. And I feel like it's just making its way back home, you know? The trick when it comes to AI in Africa and how AI is set up is that Africa has had decades, centuries of unrecorded data, stories, narratives, and data is the oil that drives AI. So we find ourselves in a dilemma right now where when Africans want to use AI, they don't feel represented. They are encountering so much bias, and there's a history to that, a political, deep history to that. So when I consider AI in Africa, I feel like there's a lot of things that we're forced to reconcile with. And, like, number one, where are the Africans in the data sets, right? Because if we want to make sure that Africans feel represented in current models, current AI models, we need to kind of like make sure that we are represented in the data that trains these models. And how are we going to do that if we don't even know the extent of the different marginalized communities spread across rural parts of Africa? Right? So it also forces us to have deep conversations about the state and rate of development in Africa. Of course, we can't access remote communities, remote rural communities in Africa if we have spent the past however many years not developing roads to access them, not developing the infrastructure for them to be able to access broadband in its different forms, But it's not all doom and gloom for us. And I believe that if applied correctly, there's a lot of potential for AI to help us resolve some of our most pressing development issues like access to healthcare, access to education, information, because the next billion users of the internet are coming from this continent, So there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of potential, and we do need to have those difficult conversations about how are we going to ensure that AI is not replicating the past in the sense that it's not extractive. We own our data. We're able to drive the profits back to our communities, and we also have like equal bargaining power when we go to the tables, to these negotiation tables with like big tech and other governments from the global north, and we're talking about how they can benefit from us, So I think, yeah, to answer your question, there's a lot of deep and hard conversations we need to have about the gaps that AI reveals on our continent, but it's not doom and gloom because this is where the profits are going to be made in the near future when it comes to AI.
We just need to make sure that we're part of that profit share.
100%.
Yes. I completely agree with you how AI is definitely forcing us to confront infrastructure issues that we clearly had put behind. We thought that we didn't have to address, and now every government is confronted with this moment. I guess that brings us to what we're doing here at the convening. A lot of these kind of conversations have been coming up, discussing about how we will participate in monetization, how we will address infrastructure issues. from your perspective, what does it mean to have artists and technologists and researchers and social technologists in the same room for these questions when it relates to AI?
Yeah. I love what Electric South has done and the work that Electric South does in general, because it collapses this artificial distance that exists between artists and technologists, and especially in the age of AI, because traditionally we like to think, or we thought of AI as this technological phenomena, but it's actually starting to become a social one as well, bringing together people from different industries, disciplines, you know, because when we look at AI, we don't only look at the models, right? So that's the software engineers. We also look at the data. So now we're talking to the data scientists. And when we speak to the data scientists, we're also speaking to researchers. We're speaking to people that know how to work with communities, like your social workers. And then we also talk, when we also think about ethics. So now we're talking to philosophers. So many people have to come around to make sense of this new dynamic we're all encountering. And I love how diverse the group is, because you have people that are actual artists who wouldn't have encountered AI unless if someone was like, you know, you can do that in a quicker, easier way, right? And you also have someone like me who gets to learn a lot from an artist, their perspective, what their challenges are. As someone who likes to use technology to solve social issues, it helps me a lot to be in a room with someone who's in academia, who can be like, well, these are the challenges that we're seeing in school and in research, you know? So the biggest thing is that we're realizing now more than ever that everything needs to be interdisciplinary, right? Working in silos does not work, because that's not how AI operates. It needs everyone represented, and it's so crazy because it's not just in how it's created and governed and dispersed, but in like the source code. Like everyone needs to be represented, even in the data. So it's this re-engineering how we operate as a society. And I think what Electric South is doing is a model that a lot of policymakers especially can learn from and just like take on.
I really, really love that. It's funny how much that bias has come up over the past few days, and how concerned the group collectively from all kinds of fields are about this bias, this sense of responsibility to protect, to ensure representation. That's really, really interesting. One of the core threads of this convening is artist-centered advocacy. It's really, really difficult to achieve. You know, I don't think I make apologies for policymakers, but even as Electric South, we've discovered how hard it is to center artists while actually creating work that can be used wider than artists. Why do you think it's important that policy advocacy isn't only left to governments and to corporations, but also includes artists and cultural voices?
Let's be honest, artists are the heartbeat of any society, right? Governments, corporations, they're the different organs. You have your lungs, you have your heart beating this, that, but everything needs a soul. Artists are the people that help us make sense of all this complex mess happening around us. They bring meaning to what policy is. Their imaginations help us connect our narratives and our stories. Policy is just a bunch of words stacked up in papers until someone can come transform it into a story that I can connect to. And that's where artists come in. It's a pity that artists haven't been involved in policy making all these years. which is why there's such a big gap when it comes to policy implementation. That's because people don't understand what you're talking about. You know, take South Africa, for example. We have one of the best constitutions in the world. Policy-wise, we're like so brilliant, but implementation falls short because culturally as a society, we don't know how to translate everything that has been written on those papers with fancy jargon and language. And that's where artists come in. So bringing artists together to be involved in this complex technical concept called AI is important, because we do need people to help us demystify and use imagination and our stories and our realities to help people connect to what the bigger picture is when it comes to what AI can unlock on the African continent.
I couldn't agree with you more. You know, even when I think of our own liberation movements, it was only when a lot of those ideologies were translated into song, into protests, that people could really connect. You know, when people were repeatedly saying "Nkosi Sikelel' Africa," it really moved people forward. So I think what you're saying is really important. Could we maybe dive a little deeper into what's at stake if artists don't engage? From my perspective, I think that a lot of the fear that we're seeing around technology is because artists haven't engaged. And on the other side, what do you see as some of the exciting opportunities for African creatives in this space?
The stakes are really big, you know. If we don't get artists involved, then we're left with the same people that we have entrusted to create all the other policies that we still don't understand to communicate this one big policy policies around AI, I mean, that we're hoping will unlock a lot of opportunities for us. And as someone who's also worked in the policy and communication space, this has literally been my bread and butter. Decoding a lot of the politics and just technicalities around legislation, regulations, and helping people understand why they should actually care. People will not get involved if they don't understand what you're talking about. So it's like we creating these amazing policies for people, but when you speak to them, or when people, number one, people don't even know where to access them. They don't understand, and when they do access them, they don't understand how that relates to them. You know, so the risk is that we need artists to help us communicate these policies so that we can change our cultural understanding as a society. Because right now, I also believe that culturally we're so disconnected because everything is not speaking to us directly. And take South Africa for an example, a country with so many different cultures, right? And our policies are not written in different languages. They're not written in Tsonga. I'm Tsonga. I've never come across a policy written in Shangaan, that's for sure, right? But my gran needs that, because my gran is very political, in fact. She's interested in where this country is going. She has a lot of opinions about what is happening to the city, what is happening to this country, but she can't have that conversation in ways that relate to the language that we use in policy making. And so that's where artists come in. You need artists to translate what is happening. So the risk is that we're going to be leaving a lot of people behind, because we actually do need everyone to be on the same page and everyone to speak the same language, because the opportunities are very, very big. Even though in Africa there is that issue of technological leapfrogging, right? Where we want to jump onto the latest, hottest tech trend without even ensuring that we have all the other checks and balances checked out. Like, yes, we are talking AI right now, and we have these data centers opening up everywhere. But how when we have like load shedding? So you're telling me these data centers are going to have electricity all the time, while people that need medical care that relies on power supply struggle? So those contestations are glaring to me, right? But there are a lot of opportunities in Africa, and I think it does, like what I said in the beginning, it forces us to go back and correct all the steps that we have missed, so that we can assure that, like for instance, data is so expensive in South Africa. If we want people to be able to use AI, like generative AI platforms, we need them to be able to afford data, right? So now that forces us to have a conversation about the affordability of connectivity. If you want rural people represented in data sets, it means how do we make sure that there's proper infrastructure in rural areas, because we want them to participate. So the opportunity is that I hope AI is the big aunt and uncle that's going to force us to just like clean up our house so that we can tap into the opportunities and just flourish.
I love that. Finally, I guess, looking to the future, how can communities like the ones that you build work together with organizations like Electric South or other organizations to shape a more equitable and inclusive tech future?
Yeah. So one thing I like to say is that there are no clear answers, there are no clear paths. We're all doing this for the first time. Even ancient civilizations, they had to figure things out for the first time. It's not like we're building this country with a manual that was passed down from like 3 million years ago, right? And we need to be open to experimentation. People are so hard on themselves, and by virtue are hard on everyone else, to not understanding that, hey, this is our first rodeo. We're trying it out, and if it does not work, it does not mean that we have failed. It just means that now we can make notes that, okay, no, we've tried this, it didn't work, let's try something else. So for communities that I work with, I think they need to embrace the concept of play and experimentation. And I love play specifically because when you're young, that's how you get to learn and explore the world, right? Being dirty, falling, walking, playing with mud, oh, that creates stains. I'm not going to do that anymore. You know, so we need to embrace play and experimentation, because through play and experimentation is how we explore the different possibilities and widen our imaginations of what's actually possible and what isn't.
Well, thank you, Ian, for such a thoughtful and inspiring conversation. I wish it could go longer. This episode is part of a special podcast series recorded live at The Convening, AI, Artists and Immersive Futures, hosted by Electric South. If you'd like to follow more of our work, visit electricsouth.org or find us on YouTube and social media under Electric South. I'm Ajwa Nkoma. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned to our next conversation.